Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Eric Ellis. I'm the head of client-facing digital experiences at Ettain Group. We're going to be talking about design thinking, notably how the predominant wave is that perhaps design thinking is bullshit. Well, I'm here to say that sometimes it isn't. And it's really about the way in which we approach design thinking that makes it powerful and valuable to you and your organization. So a little bit about me. I've led design strategies at Airbnb and Google, Intuit, Dropbox, and others during my time prior to Ettain Group at Lithium. Lithium Technologies is a SaaS-based software company, and we got to hone our trade, if you will, design thinking being one of those tools in our tool belt to create amazing capabilities. I built a creative practice prior to that while at EMC, and I've also worked as a design lead at Bank of America. Now at Ettain Group, we're a staffing company based in Charlotte with practices all over the country. And I sit inside the Managed Solutions group. Think of Managed Solutions almost like a professional services type organization inside of a staffing firm, which allows us to have all kinds of internal subject matter expertise in IT, digital, healthcare, professional, and government, and then leverage contingent labor contractors to get work done in a co-managed solution format with our clients. And so we use design thinking in many of our engagements to try to understand the art of the possible. What can we do when our clients are going through digital transformations of their own and are looking at ways to solve problems before they build up teams to go execute? So you're here, and that's awesome. It's great that we're able to do this, and certainly in this time to be able to do it virtually and in a recorded way. So we'll talk about design thinking in 2020. What does design thinking today kind of look like? And then we'll get under the hood a bit. The timing here, we'll compress it down to 30 minutes. But our goal is to better understand the practice of design thinking so we can really be a beacon for its value and advocate for it and use it in the right way. And I think that's really what this is all about, is used correctly and used contextually, it can be very powerful. But when it's out of context, it can be viewed as bullshit, as fat that needs to be trimmed out. And that's not what we want. So let's start with a little story. I love stories. Design thinking is great storytelling, if anything. And we'll go through one example of that towards the end of this talk. But prior to that, let me tell you a story. This is my son, Jack. Jack's a 7-year-old now. He's about to go into second grade next year. But when I did this little, call it a study, he was in kindergarten. And I noticed Jack loves Legos. And he loves to build things. And he gets these packs. If you look today, and for those who joined my talk in 2019 at Triad, you heard me tell this story. These packs come in these elaborate instructional step-by-step. This is how you build a thing with Legos. But one thing I noticed about Jack is Jack likes to take all those pieces that he gets in those boxes, tear them all up, and put them in a box. He basically has boxo Legos, which is kind of what we all grew up with when we had Legos. And he sits very quietly in his room, and we don't hear from him for hours on end, and he builds these elaborate creative things. And it's really interesting to watch him and his process for creation. And God knows what he comes up. I have no idea what this is. I don't know why a stormtrooper and Yoda are together in one thing. And I said, Jack, I don't understand. What? Tell me what this is. And he said, Dad, the war is over. The stormtroopers and the rebels are now friends. And I said, oh, I would have never conceived of that. That would have never entered my frame of reference into Star Wars. But his creativity and his back and forth with trying to impress his mother and me on what he was building, ultimately to come up with something creative like this, is something we see out of children all the time. And we lose that. There's something that we as adults lose as we get older, that ability to really start to think outside the box. And enter design thinking. Those are some of the things that we look at when we apply it. The ability to look outside of ourselves and really look at our end clients, our end users, those who will consume the creative things that we ultimately build. So let's look at it in the context of today. Why does it matter? Well, we first have to have a quick primer. Let's remember what design thinking is from a process standpoint. It's empathize, developing a deep understanding of the challenges of your end users, defining what clearly the problems are that you want to solve, brainstorming potential solutions, selecting those, prioritizing, develop and honing the ultimate prioritized ideas that you lead forward with, and then getting them in the hands of your end users, testing all or part of those solutions, and using that all along the way to go back to the beginning at times through empathize, define, and ideate all over again to really mold the clay. Make sure that what it is you are delivering has been properly vetted and in some cases re-vetted. Does this still matter today? Does design thinking still matter? And I would argue now more than ever, especially as companies embark in digital transformations and topics and capabilities and processes like scaled agile become the norm. It's very easy for companies to lose sight of what it is that they are trying to accomplish, that the goal has really started to shift towards TCO, towards the ability to get something out faster and with the greatest quality. And then we start to lose sight of what it is that we're trying to accomplish and why it ultimately matters. And the detractors say all of the things that we hear all the time. You've probably heard this in your own organization. Design thinking is just too waterfall. The process is very linear and it's slow, and sprinting is ultimately the antidote for that. It overly democratizes the word design, that it treats everyone in the room as designers when in fact they're not. And it starts to perhaps denigrate the practice of user experience. It fails too often. We see prototype after prototype going out to market and not getting the traction that we need. And we're really spinning our wheels when what we really need is muscle to get MVPs out the door and real things rather than prototypes. Or it's too idealistic. Once you complete a prototype, it's thrown away and there's really no utility for it. You can't scale it. It's one and done. All very valid arguments, right? We hear that a lot. And we'll be looking at those arguments throughout the next few minutes. What we do know, though, that design centricity is a proven strategy. This was a study done. The last study of this was 2016, and it's called the Design Value Index. And it starts to look at companies who then focus on design orientation and those where they sort of rank from an S&P perspective. And so clearly those who have pivoted towards innovative, novel ideas focused on end users see success. And I've personally had experience with it too. When it works, there's really no argument to it. Airbnb is a great example. I participated in a redesign, an envisioning of their host community. Hosts are people who own apartment complexes and homes and yurts and all kinds of things. And hosting is a job. It's a profession. In many instances, it's a vocation. And so those who want to be good hosts need a place to interact with other hosts and learn. But when you look back at Airbnb as a company, it almost went bust. And there were times, and it's hard to believe that in pre-2010 there almost was no Airbnb. And the founders of Airbnb recognized that, look, in order to fix problems by experimenting, they had to be okay with the fact that, look, not everything scales at first, and that's okay. One of the things that they noticed was that photos, high quality images of people's homes and places that they were renting out were the end all be all of the successful booking. And so the hosts themselves went out with high quality cameras and photographers, and they started taking pictures and posting them and replacing the ones that were fuzzy or low quality taken with phones. Back then, cameras weren't nearly as high quality as they are today. And their bookings shot up, and they started to see that it's really about telling that story through professional imagery that ultimately was going to be the success for Airbnb. They didn't know how they were going to get there, but they knew that it worked, and they started making money. Well, flash forward 12, 13 years later, and I'm leading the strategy development for the Airbnb host community. And we noticed something. We were really asking the wrong questions of what our hosts needed. This is really the crux. This is the key for the successful transformation. Design thinking allowed us to reframe our worldview, our host view of the world. And we started, instead of asking, how can hosts find frequently asked questions or get information for Airbnb to make more money, we looked at a much broader question, which was how can we provide an engaging, trusting, and shared space to increase host success and satisfaction with Airbnb? We got to that question by utilizing aspects of design thinking. Because when you don't, you start looking at technology for technology's sake. If anybody recognizes this picture, this was the Google Glass. They call these people glass holes. And I love this quote from the MIT Technology Review. No one could understand why you'd want to have that thing on your face in the way of normal social interaction. It was tech for tech's sake. It didn't have inherent value to the end user. It was just cool tech. And so with Airbnb, the same thing was true. We had to get to the crux of what hostfulness was, rather than what tools could we provide hosts to be better hosts. And I started to learn that actually years later. It started to click for me just recently as I was working for a local grocer, a regional grocer. And one of the things that you notice in this picture is this sort of substandard digital ordering experience that this grocer was experiencing. You would order a sub or order a pizza or order from the deli online. And when you went to pick it up, you noticed something. And you can see the gentleman to the left was actually one of our test orderers. And he can't figure out what the heck he's supposed to do once he submits his order. And he's looking around and he's trying to figure out what the next step in the process is. And if you look very closely in the center of the picture, you'll see a little yellow sign. And that yellow sign is actually indicating to him that that's where his order is that was already made. But the end-to-end experience was never fleshed out, only the digital aspect of it. And so he had no way to know that all he had to do was skip the line and grab his sub and be out the door. And so that substandard experience really wasn't about the digital solution. It was about the end-to-end customer experience solution. It was a humanistic problem. And in many instances, digital transformations start with humanistic challenges, not just technological ones. So let's look under the hood a little bit and some of the phases and some of the challenges that we see, the bullshittiness, as I like to say, and maybe some of the things that you can counter to really get to truth, to get to value behind design thinking. So let's start with empathize. Remember, empathize is developing a deep understanding of the challenge. And you're doing that by truly understanding who your users are and what they need and what they say. And what are some of the challenges that we see? We see that research is directed to the business, not end users. In many instances, I've seen design thinking leads interviewing stakeholders within the company and not really acknowledging the fact that the stakeholders inside the business are not the end users of the product or service. And so they're getting a very biased viewpoint of what the problems are. Anthropological research confused with usability research. I'm in no way knocking usability research. Certainly understanding human-computer interaction is key to any design ops operation. However, anthropological research really looks at those humanistic qualities well before a solution is created. You're asking why questions. You're understanding humans and their interaction with technology in the business, rather than trying to understand if a button is the right color or an A/B test to see if a layout performs better than others. That's more usability centric. Anthropological research starts before the problem has clearly been identified. Workshops are used in place of real research. That's really key. We see this a lot, and it leads to a lot of those bullshit comments that we see, is that really the workshops, those points in time where you're bringing together internal stakeholders, maybe even end users, to start to ideate has to occur after some of that empathize research that we'll talk about in a second are conducted. That way you have a solid foundation by which to ideate. So what are some ways to improve? Well, let's start talking about them rather than just listing them out. Let's look at some of these techniques. Interviews, of course, are huge. It's the majority of the empathize research that I've performed in design thinking engagements. They're broad level, they're empathetic, they're contextual discussions, really, with stakeholders, end users, to break down problems and reveal patterns. You saw an example prior of a field study, experience what the users are actually experienced by embedding yourself into their world. There are other ways to do it too. You could take it to certain levels. Sometimes you don't have the ability to do this, but personal journaling, handing over the camera to an end user, giving them instructions on how to record a product or service experience, or stepping into the worlds of peripheral extremes. Cohorts that you might not see are your primary audiences, and understanding what they experience to really get at novel solutions that you would not otherwise ideate upon if you were just looking at your primary user base. You know, we don't have the ability to practice in this webinar, but this is something that you can practice to hone your skills as a design thinking lead and possibly to implement design thinking into your organization. You know, one of the ways is to interview your neighbor or interview a peer. And I love to use this when you're a lead researcher for a hoverboard sharing service. So think Back to the Future when Marty McFly's on a hoverboard, and your company is struggling with low adoption and low growth. And your participant, the person that you're interviewing, is a local commuter. And maybe he or she has tried your service once before, but has never tried it again. And you want to learn why. What is it about commuting that could improve your business? And so you think about how to empathize and how to interview. You know, you're introducing yourself. Yes, you're introducing your project. But after that, it's really about them. You have to build rapport. You have to evoke stories on what it means to commute in your locale. Understand the emotions behind commuting. Follow up with question statements, and then wrap up. And you can kind of see some of the kinds of questions that you would ask. And notice that these questions are not asking about the hoverboard technology. It's really asking about commutingness. Can you tell me about the first time you used our service or commuted in rush hour traffic? What do you remember about that? Why is that? And why is a certain aspect of alternative commuting important to you? And what emotions do you have about it? It can really get to core aspects of what it means to be human, frankly, when it comes to commuting, and really get to deep layers of need. Here's an example of that for, you know, you can kind of see this. This is an example of interviewing a child who is flying by himself and learning about what it means to be a traveler away from the family. And you can kind of see that, you know, you're starting to see things like emotions. Well, were you worried? Yes, I was worried. Flying was fine and the stewardess was awesome. But, you know, when I got into the airport, everyone's so angry. Well, what do you mean by angry? Well, you know, in the airplane out, someone's always asking for if you need help, but it's every man for yourself when you're in the airport. Starting to reveal some very interesting things that you may not get if you asked about a product or service that you're trying to change. So you get all that, and then you try to clearly articulate, well, what do you have? When you're looking at the research, you have to define the problem. And we often start with the solutions in mind. We start to think about what it is that we can fix once the research is complete. But we use design thinking to define problems that don't require us to think anthropologically. And frankly, I think that makes people feel as if the process is very messy. And I would argue that, you know, in many instances, it's not messy enough. That it is often the case that you get to the define aspect of a design thinking engagement, and you have to go back and interview again and really find out, did you have everything you need to ultimately define the problem? Well, one of the ways to improve that is to use things like 5 whys to explore cause and effect relationships. Here's an example of that, going back to the Airbnb community. You know, we really had to go back up when we had the initial assumption that hosts really just needed a place to go to frequently ask questions, really receive from Airbnb what they needed to be good hosts. We really weren't getting at hostfulness. And in order to get to hostfulness, we used 5 whys. Hosts are churning, meaning hosts were leaving Airbnb. Well, why? Well, hosting was perceived as difficult when we performed our research. Well, why was that? Well, they weren't confident in being hosts. Why weren't they confident? Well, they don't feel empowered to be hosts in the first place. Now we're starting to get somewhere. Where does empowerment come from? Well, in order to be empowered, you have to learn. There's really no way to learn. Well, why is that? Well, because there's no ability to learn. There's no sharing that exists between hosts who are already very good and hosts who are starting in the Airbnb platform for the very first time. It's funny, if you kind of look back, you could kind of see what you came to in these 5 whys and what outcomes might have been derived if we had stopped at the first why. Hosts are churning. Well, they could be churning for a multitude of reasons. It could be that the call center didn't have enough manpower and we needed to up the support and chat and give hosts what they need at the point in time they need it. But that was really the furthest from the truth. You know, this is an example of what we did in that grocer experience, where we started to look at defining the problem by understanding the journey today. And I'm not going to go through each one of these cells, but you can kind of see that when we mapped what the ghost customer was doing and thinking in every part of the experience, we also added, well, what are they feeling as they're going through? And we started to notice that there were a lot of worriness and irritation and puzzlement throughout the experience tied back to their actual journey. And again, it wasn't really about the technology. It had more to do with the in-store experience. So we take those experiences, those doing, thinking, feeling, the 5 whys, and we ask, what do customers ultimately need? The how might we? How might we ultimately get customer experiences to improve when it comes to ordering online? Here's another example here. Thumbtack is a place where you can find carpenters and repair people and really those who are in your neighborhood to fix things or improve things or build things in your home. And so we had to find a place for those pros to develop and support each other. But it was not, how do we deflect call center volume by giving pros a low-cost support channel? That's what the business came to us to initially solve. We changed the paradigm. We changed the thinking. We changed the question by looking humanistically at the problem. Because when we don't know what we want to solve, we ultimately get products like the Microsoft Zune. And if you're old enough to remember the story behind the Zune, in many ways, technologically far superior to what eventually became Apple's iPod. But there was no reason for it to be there. There were features that were being introduced, like physically putting the Zunes back to back with one another in order to transfer songs that users never needed. They never used. They never asked for. It was never a problem. And so it became a technological solution for technology's sake. So we've started to empathize. We've started to define problems humanistically, using things like 5 whys to clearly articulate problems. And then we're coming into ideate and prototype. And what's the bullshittiness that we see in the ideate phase? You know, participants aren't in the right frame of mind before they're ideating, or they're settling on the right or the very obvious solution. Hey, we were all here to create this thing. We all know that. And it's sold as a game-changing event. I've seen many instances where workshops are put together to ideate that will, quote unquote, change the world or change the future of the company. And then that last one, the belief that we're all designers here. Starting from the back up, or I will start from the top down. You know, participants aren't often in the right frame of mind because there's tension. Those who are coming together, if done right, come from all different parts of the company to solve problems. A lot of the ways that you can do that are icebreakers and games. Get people used to being together, even when it's virtual. being able to do things that introduce themselves and feel at ease with one another go a long way towards being able to solve problems together later in the workshop. You know, a lot of the times that need to get to quality over quantity is the predominant theme of the workshop, and it's really the opposite. It feels counterintuitive, but in reality, you're looking for quantity of ideas. You're looking for people to come up with solutions, as many off the top of their heads as possible. Worry about prioritization as you go. And don't forget to converge after you diverge. And that really goes back to quantity of ideas over quality. As you start to get those volumes of ideas, you won't settle on the right or obvious solution first, because you'll have so many that really the goal will be about prioritization. I get this question a lot when you start. When you're in whatever exercises that you choose to use, I've found that most of the time, nothing really holds a candle to a really nice big white sheet of paper with Post-its, and people having individual conversations at a time. They're focusing on quantity. You're encouraging wild ideas and really deferring judgment of those ideas until you're able to identify themes, commonalities amongst them all. You can see in this picture where black markers are kind of drawing lines where similarities are being put together. And yes, and time limits are good. Focusing on a particular area or feature might be needed in order to kind of hone the scope or the point of the exercise. And dot voting, you don't see this here, but little simple dots that you can ask people to, after they're completing with their ideas, vote on others, really helps prioritization downstream. There's one thing that I see missing in most workshops that I think really helps to drive to the so what behind those wild ideas, and that's story writing. So we know the world our users have inhabited. We've theoretically done some journey mapping, some as is current state journey mapping, and we've hypothesized on what the needs might be. We've brainstormed on novel ideas, but we have to tell that story, that vision for an idealistic future. We go back to that Back to the Future theme, and we start to get the setting is Marty, and he's finding himself in the future, in an unfamiliar time, and he's got a conflict, and his conflict is Griff run-in with some local questionable local teenagers, and he finds a hoverboard, and here's Griff trying to grab him and snatch him and pummel him, but Marty ultimately saves the family. His family's future, because he uses the hoverboard in an unconventional way. You look through this and it's a compelling story. It's really a scene to a movie, but in and of itself, it's sort of a compelling scene. And that's what you want to ultimately encourage your story writers to do when you're trying to take these novel ideas and put them in the context of a scene that a user might experience. And you see the middle there, the MacGuffin. And if you look through, if you Google what a MacGuffin is, you'll get references to Alfred Hitchcock. The MacGuffin is really the tool. It's the catalyst. It's what Marty ultimately uses to change the story. But it's not about the hoverboard. The story, the scene, is really not about the whiz bang technology of the hoverboard. It's the catalyst that changes the impact to Marty in the story. And so the technology and the capabilities that come from the big ideas are often those MacGuffins. You're not talking about what the technology or the digital thing can necessarily do in terms of where buttons are placed or where the menu is. This is a great practice for non-designers who might be shy about trying to come up with a solution they might know little about. But you're really trying to put it in the context of a larger story. You're using your interview findings as fuel. You already know where the challenges lie. And you're really trying to focus on that humanistic aspect, aspect of the main character, that change, but making sure that the MacGuffin is not the change that you're looking for. It's the main character's change. And then we start to converge into solutions. And there are lots of different ways to do that. We talked about dot voting, but ultimately you're trying to get to something real. And I'll end on this aspect of it, prototyping and testing. You know, we see a lot of the bullshittiness of, well, look, prototyping is just a waste of time. We might as well just build it. Or we're diving into the very first good idea. We don't even know if the first good idea was the right idea we want to ultimately get in front of users. What I would say is this, is that modern design systems and modern capabilities, Sketch and Vision, all kinds of things, really allow us to simulate the real thing quite quickly, within days. As long as the team is keeping an eye on the MLP, not the MVP, the minimum lovable product. Can you build a prototype that is functional, reliable, usable, has good UX and design at a minimal volume? You're going to do a much better job of really trying to make sure that every functional aspect of a potential solution is there. As long as you focus on desirability, feasibility, and viability, that's really what prototyping is all about. You can see the shopping cart that IDEO attempted to build in the late 90s. And if you go search on this on YouTube, you'll see the original ABC Nightline video of this that ultimately ended up being the catalyst for all kinds of different ways in which we shop at Target and in other grocery stores. And many detractors look at that original shopping cart and say, well, this is an example of design thinking being bullshit because this never really came to light in any grocery store you would ever see. And I would argue and say, well, it actually did. It just took many years for that change to happen. And sometimes that's what happens with design thinking. And I'll leave you with this. The last really aspect of that, design thinking is bullshit is really around throughput. And, a recent study by IBM, for IBM by Forrester, said that really adopting design thinking can actually reduce time for development and testing as much as 33% downstream. It's because the backlog that the developers and testers are using have been generated by the stories that got created in design thinking. It's the clay you molded up front to be much faster downstream. The analogy of measure twice, cut once. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of putting design thinking into regular practice, but not be afraid that that's going to upset scaled agile. I want to thank you for your time. You can email me. You can look at digital.ettaingroup.com to see what we're all about. Hope you learned a few things, and thank you.